and welcome to Fun Scale Models. This series is focusing on the P40C Tomahawk Park Flyer model. The next thing to add is infill between the stringers. We're going to use some scrap 1/8 balsa for this. The reason being is to allow for the cooling air to pass through the inlet here and then out this area. So we need to basically leave this section open, but we're going to want to infill these 4 panels there. I'm going to leave about 3/4 of an inch gap to allow for the air to escape. So using some scrap, I'm just going to go ahead and roughly mark it. So this is, right there is about 3/4. And what we'll need to do is check on the fit. So you need to trim a little bit more off this end, maybe even spinning it around might work. Actually, probably will. So what I'll do is I'll slightly bevel the sides to help match the stringers. Now we do want to leave this slightly proud of the stringer. So you can kind of see there's a bit of a stand out right there. The reason being is that allows us to sort of sand the correct shape into it. I'll go ahead and glue it in place with some white glue or PVA. I like to use for infilling like a white glue like an Elmer's or PVA because it does sand better than CA. So I'll go ahead and I'll apply my PVA. I'll wipe away the excess glue. So you can see that's just sitting in there nicely. I'll go ahead and I'll do the remaining 3 additional patterns in this section. And here you can see all 4 sections have been installed. Really didn't take a whole lot of time, maybe about 5-10 minutes to complete it. Now, if you're going to be using the model and flying off of grass and belly landing, I do recommend also filling in these 4 sections. Even in the softest grass, I do tend to get some puncture holes to the tissue in this area here. So it'll just help prevent that. What I'm planning on using is some 1/4 inch balsa because we have a bit of a curve here. And so to be able to encapsulate all that, you need a little bit thicker wood. I'll go ahead and I'll add that and I'll show you what that looks like. Here's the front sections put in. They're a bit more proud because again we have to sand the shape not only this direction but this direction. We'll let this dry and we'll go ahead and sand these to match the contour of the fuse. The infill dry, we're now ready to start trimming back these pieces. We use a combination of sanding blocks as well as our block plane. And just like we did with some of the other parts, we're just going to take down the high points. And you sort of want to work in this area. So you want to do your shaving in line with the stringers. That way you'll leave, if you do it like this, like this, like this, you'll leave the high point along the center line right here. And again, just depending on which direction seems to work best, you can switch that up. And we'll finish it up with the sanding block. So here is the initial sanding. What I'm going to do to help get some of these hard to get areas is I'm going to coat this with the Easy Dope, which is basically a thin glue. Let that dry, harden up some of the fibers here, and then go ahead and hit it with a sanding pad. So I've added some additional features to the fuselage here. The first one I'm going to show you are the push rod exits. So this is just made from scrap balsa wood. There's one on each side. Of course, the push rod would go through there. The other thing that I did is I added some additional decking to the rear section here. Also made a hatch for the to cover up the servos. And the reason for is that this airplane has a very long nose moment, and we're having our heavy motor, even though it's only 24 grams, pretty far out. So we're going to need to move the battery pack further aft to help counterbalance that if we don't want to add any dead weight back to the tail here. With that, even though the battery pack is only about an ounce, ounce and a half, we need to move it further back. Moving it further back means that we need to make sure that when we're installing the battery, it doesn't hit the top of the servos right here. So sort of kind of tough to see in the camera angle here, but there is sufficient height between the top of the servo horns and this plate here. The other thing that I have to sort of sort out is I do want to put the cockpit in this model. I think it really dresses it up and adds a nice look to it. But if the battery does end up needing to be in this area, I'll have to figure out how I'm going to do that. Perhaps maybe I'll make some sort of removable plate for the battery pack, and then when not flying it, I can just put the cockpit back in. The last thing that I did here is I added some additional scraps to sort of box in the area on the center section here. So when this gets removed, it's going to be covered completely, and then the servos get reinstalled later and this cut out. Eventually we'll put the belly pan over all this and it'll cover up the bottom of the servos. And here you can also see that I had sanded smooth the infill area that I had used Easy Dope to sort of seal the wood. It's nice and smooth now. In one of the earlier videos, I talked about how we could help make these etching marks disappear. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this wood filler. It's the right approximate color, of course, to match the balsa wood here. Might be a little bit darker, but for the overall, it's going to look better than this. Now, one thing about this is the tail section, obviously. You do need to take in consideration weight that will be being added. Now, for this particular design, it's got a very long nose, and so getting some weight behind the CG is actually not a bad thing. But if you have a short-nosed airplane, it's something you want to take in consideration. So I'm going to show basically what you do here to get this on. It's not very complicated. Again, this is Elmer's wood filler. So I just use an old credit card. I think this might be a hotel room key. And just put a small amount on. And you can even do it where there's an overlap of parts. Sort of keep working your way around. I added a little bit of water to kind of help make this a little soupy so it goes on a little bit easier. And I'll go through the rest of the tail surfaces that way. I've added a bit previously to the rudder here, so you can see I'm starting to sand a little bit. And it's okay if you get a little bit of an over the edge. You can always sand it with a small sanding block just to kind of make it uniform. But just sort of take your time, lightly sand. Again, I'm supporting the underneath of the structure so that I'm not putting a lot of stress on it while I'm sanding it. You can even use a larger block if you want. And as you keep going around, you can just kind of sand it down as needed, and it does sort of help hide those etching marks. We need to join the outer panels to the center panel. I've mounted it to the board here. Now, looking at the details of the plan down here, you can see there's a reference from the front view that it's a 1.25 inch raise on each side. So I went and made myself just a real simple cardboard template that's going to sit underneath the wing panel itself. So I just want to make sure that, and I'm doing some prep work before I start gluing to see how this fits. So I've got that underneath W8, and you can see here, there's really not much of a gap at all. Now, if I needed to, I could always just sand the outer panel just to make sure that it's as tight of a fit as possible. So we're going to go ahead and use some tight bond glue to join our halves. I like to use a tight bond for the really, really critical areas. And just going to apply some glue. Now I've put some wax paper down here, and I'm just going to work on the alignment. And yep, I can see I've got a nice bond there. Decent amount of glue. Go ahead and put that right over W8. And again, looking at this here, I'm going to use some of these small clamps to sort of hold it in place. And then I've just got just a little bit of weight here, nothing heavy, because we don't want it to make a significant amount of pressure on the wing. But that'll sort of hold it flush to the cardboard template that we have. Go ahead and let this dry, and we'll do the other side as well. So we've got both panels gluing, and I used quite a few of these clamps. It really seems to sort of help keep the two pieces together. We'll let this thoroughly dry before handling. So here we have the wing halves glued together. Overall, I think it turned out pretty good. You go ahead and see here, we've got a good seam between the two ribs there. One thing I wanted to discuss a little bit further is, while the original model doesn't have any additional stringers that join all the different ribs together, that doesn't mean that you can't add one. What I've found for these smaller models, it's not necessary to have that additional strengthening, but if you're going to be putting, let's say, a 3S or maybe even a little bit bigger motor in there, or plan on doing some pretty heavy aerobatics, it doesn't hurt. So what I've done is I recommend putting in an additional 3/32 stringer or 2. This is actually made of basswood. If you don't have basswood, that's okay. Just use a heavier or a more dense balsa wood, and you may also want to double up on your stringers. The question is then, where do we want to put this additional stringer? I'm going to actually put it from this rib to this rib. I'm going to use one solid item on the bottom. You can add it on top, but I think it's going to be more beneficial to have it on the bottom. If you want to add some additional stringers, you could double up, so put 2 right next to each other. This bay is an option. However, we do have the cutout holes for the servo leads, so that might be a little bit more of a trickier area to put it in. This you wouldn't be able to do because this is where the servos sit. The last bay would be probably from here to here. Now, I don't necessarily think you need to run longer than these two here. So what I'll go ahead and do is I've actually added a small rubber band to the wingtips. I'll use that to sort of help hold the stringer in place, and we'll mark it for adding the notches. To cut the notches, there's a couple of different options you can use. You can use a hacksaw and cut that down, across the grain here, and then use an X-Acto to trim that last little bottom out. You can use a file. This one actually happens to be 3/32 in diameter. and that works out really perfect. So again, if you're going to do that, you would just sort of set it in your spot where you mark it, or you have it marked, excuse me, sand down, and that would fit in there nice. The other option, and this is something that I've just made myself, this is a piece of stringer that has some pretty coarse grit sandpaper on it. It happens to be 3/32 also in square. This is just a piece of scrap of that basswood stringer. That also works really well, and you just sort of, same thing as you would with your file, just lightly sand, and there you can see it's a pretty good fit. So we'll use one of those options on the wing and get those notches entered. So we have all the notches now sanded in. Go from this point to this point. Next we'll be adding the actual stringer. So again, this is just 3/32 basswood that's been cut to length. If you don't have basswood, again, just use a hard balsa. Go ahead and we'll fit that in place. I'm going to start at one side and work my way across the wing. We'll let that dry and we'll sand it if needed.